The Trump administration has just delivered a stark ultimatum to Cuba: negotiate a deal with Washington or brace for an intensified wave of economic penalties. Yet what unfolded next caught nearly everyone off guard. Just 7 days later, China announced it would send Cuba 30,000 tons of rice. No strings attached, no conditions imposed. The first cargo has already docked at a Cuban harbor, and scenes of gratitude have swept across the island. For many Cubans, this wasn't just food arriving at their ports. It was a lifeline extended at a moment when options had all but disappeared. To put that figure in perspective, 30,000 tons of rice is no trivial shipment. It's enough to sustain hundreds of thousands of people for an entire year under normal conditions. In a crisis scenario, it can provide emergency rations for over 1 million individuals for more than 10 days. So the question that emerges is both simple and layered. Why did Beijing choose this exact moment to send such significant aid to Havana? And what does this move reveal about the shifting contours of global power, diplomacy, and survival? If you're interested in stories that explore the intersection of geopolitics, economics, and human resilience, consider subscribing so you don't miss our upcoming investigations. Now, let's unpack what's really happening in Cuba and why it matters far beyond the Caribbean. A nation under pressure. Cuba's long struggle for food security. Tucked into the northwestern edge of the Caribbean, Cuba is a small island nation that often flies under the radar in global headlines. Yet behind its sun-soaked beaches and historic cities lies a population of more than 10 million people, the third largest in the Caribbean region. In 2024, Cuba's gross domestic product hovered around $100 billion. But economic figures alone don't capture the daily reality. For decades, Cuba has been seen by much of the world as a country trapped in chronic hardship. One of the clearest signs of this struggle is the government's continued reliance on a food rationing system. For more than a generation, Cuban families have depended on ration booklets to access basic staples like rice, beans, cooking oil, and sugar. Over the past 10 years, agriculture's share of the national economy has barely moved, remaining stuck at roughly 4% of GDP. For millions of households, the cost of food has become an unbearable weight. And food scarcity isn't a periodic crisis, it's a persistent condition. According to estimates from United Nations food agencies, Cuba must import approximately 80% of the food it consumes each year. That figure has actually climbed in recent years. Take rice, for example, the cornerstone of the Cuban diet. In 2024, domestic rice production totaled just 80,000 tons. Meanwhile, the country needed around 700,000 tons to meet demand. That leaves a staggering shortfall of nearly 90%. To fill that gap, Cuba spends upwards of $1.8 billion annually on food imports. In 2025 alone, Havana purchased over $300 million worth of agricultural goods from the United States, primarily pork and chicken. Additional supplies, rice, flour, and other essentials, are sourced from Brazil and European markets. This raises an obvious question. If the island faces such a dire food deficit, why hasn't it built up its own agricultural capacity? After all, Cuba isn't landlocked or climatically barren. It sits in a tropical belt, blessed with ample sunlight, consistent warmth, and seasonal rainfall. The country has nearly 3 million hectares of arable land, so the problem isn't the soil or the weather, it's everything else. The weight of sanctions. How the U.S. embargo strangled Cuba's agriculture. Cuba's agricultural collapse didn't happen overnight. It's the result of a sustained, multi-decade economic siege that began in the mid-20th century. Starting in the 1960s, the United States imposed a sweeping trade embargo on Cuba that has lasted nearly 6 decades. These restrictions didn't just target finished goods. They cut deep into the veins of commerce: financial transactions, shipping insurance, spare parts, technical know-how, and access to global markets. One of the most devastating tools in this arsenal is what's known as the 180-day rule. Under this regulation, any vessel that docks at a Cuban port to load or unload cargo is prohibited from entering a U.S. port for the next 180 days. For international shipping companies, this creates an impossible choice: do business with Cuba and lose access to the world's largest economy, or bypass Cuba entirely. Most choose the latter. The result is that even willing trade partners often refuse to send ships to Cuban shores, fearing the secondary consequences. But the isolation doesn't stop at the docks. The United States also placed critical agricultural inputs, fertilizers, pesticides, irrigation equipment, tractor parts, on the embargo list. Modern farming is built on these inputs. Without them, productivity collapses. And when ships won't deliver them, and when financial sanctions make payment nearly impossible, the entire system begins to buckle. Cuban agriculture, once a proud sector, has been left gasping for resources it cannot access and technologies it cannot afford. Under these conditions, Cuba had little choice but to import food, even from the very country imposing the blockade. It's a bitter irony that highlights just how constrained Havana's options have become. By January 2026, tensions between the two nations reached a boiling point once again. Cuba's National Defense Council formally approved a set of contingency measures described as applicable during a state of war. Officials were quick to clarify that this wasn't a declaration of war, but rather an update to defensive protocols designed to prepare for worst-case scenarios under prolonged economic pressure. And then, in the midst of this escalating standoff, China did something unexpected. While Washington tightened the screws, Beijing opened the tap, delivering 30,000 tons of rice to Cuba. So what exactly prompted this move? China steps in emergency aid in the shadow of sanctions. In January 2026, the Chinese government announced an emergency food relief program for Cuba. The initiative involves a total of 30,000 tons of rice, valued at approximately $11 million US. Rather than delivering the entire shipment at once, China opted for a phased approach, multiple batches arriving over several months. This method ensures a steady flow of supplies and prevents logistical bottlenecks or storage issues on the Cuban side. Once the rice reaches port, it's received by Cuban authorities and distributed free of charge to the public through existing government channels. On January 19th, the first batch of Chinese rice arrived at the Mariel Container Terminal, one of Cuba's most modern ports. After a formal handover ceremony at a food distribution warehouse operated by Havana's Ministry of Domestic Trade, the rice entered the national supply chain. Shortly after, Beijing confirmed that a second shipment had safely docked at the port of Santiago de Cuba, with additional vessels already en route. According to the plan, 2 more large deliveries are scheduled to arrive in the first half of 2026, completing the full 30,000-ton commitment. Cuban officials and ordinary citizens alike have expressed deep appreciation. For many on the island, this gesture wasn't just about the rice itself. It was about recognition, the sense that at their most vulnerable moment, someone was paying attention, someone cared enough to act. But this raises a deeper question. Why now? Why did China choose this particular juncture to launch such a substantial aid package? The Venezuela factor: oil, medicine, and a partnership under siege. To understand China's timing, you have to zoom out and look at the broader regional picture, specifically what's happening in Venezuela. Shortly after Donald Trump assumed office as the 47th President of the United States, his administration moved quickly to reinstate and expand sanctions on Venezuela. Among the most significant measures was an executive order threatening a 25% tariff on any country that imports Venezuelan crude oil. At the same time, Washington tightened existing licenses and exemptions related to Venezuelan petroleum exports. The target of this policy wasn't just Caracas. It was also Havana. For years, Cuba and Venezuela have maintained a unique barter arrangement. Venezuela supplies Cuba with heavily discounted crude oil, and in return, Cuba sends thousands of doctors, nurses, and healthcare professionals to provide medical services across Venezuelan communities. It's an exchange built on mutual dependency, energy for expertise. In 2025, Venezuela was delivering an average of 27,000 barrels of oil per day to Cuba. But as U.S. sanctions ramped up again, those shipments began to falter. Tankers were blocked or rerouted. Insurance companies refused coverage. The flow of affordable oil, once steady and reliable, slowed to a trickle. Then on January 3, 2026, the situation escalated dramatically. Trump authorized military action against Venezuela, deploying forces to arrest President Nicolas Maduro. In the aftermath, a U.S.-backed interim government took control of Venezuela's oil sector, and one of its first declared priorities was to halt petroleum exports to Cuba. For Havana, this wasn't just an economic blow, it was existential. Cuba's power grid is almost entirely dependent on imported fuel. In the first 10 months of 2025, total fuel imports had already dropped by around 35% year over year, worsening an already chronic electricity shortage. By early 2026, as Venezuelan oil disappeared and Mexican supplies were also paused for reassessment, the fuel gap grew wider by the day. And when fuel runs out, the lights go off. But it doesn't stop there. The domino effect. How energy shortages collapse food systems. When electricity becomes scarce, the consequences ripple outward in brutal, cascading waves. The first systems to fail are water pumps. Without power, irrigation networks shut down. Farms can't water crops. Agricultural output drops even further. Next, processing plants and repair workshops go dark. Tractors break down and stay broken. Harvesting equipment sits idle. Transport trucks can't be maintained. Cold storage facilities lose refrigeration, and perishable goods, meat, dairy, vegetables, spoil before they can reach consumers. In Havana and other major cities, power rationing in January 2026 meant outages lasting 10 hours or more at a stretch, sometimes longer depending on equipment failures and the erratic arrival of fuel shipments. When staple foods like rice, beans, and cooking oil are simultaneously affected by breakdowns in transportation, refrigeration, and processing, the result is predictable: panic buying, hoarding, and supply chain collapse. Social pressure mounts quickly. Frustration turns to anger. Anger can turn to unrest. This is the context in which China's 30,000 tons of rice arrived. It didn't solve all of Cuba's problems, but it provided breathing room. It bought time. And perhaps most importantly, it sent a signal to Cubans, to Washington, and to the world. A pattern of support, China's long-term engagement with Cuba. This isn't the first time Beijing has stepped in to support Cuba's struggling agricultural sector. Over the past 5 years, Cuba's farm output has been on a steady decline. Chronic shortages of foreign currency, inadequate supplies of fuel and fertilizer, and the growing frequency of extreme weather events have all taken their toll. Between 2019 and 2023, corn production fell from roughly 276,000 tons to just 160,000 tons. By 2024, raw sugar production, once the backbone of Cuba's export economy, dropped below 150,000 tons, the lowest level in over a century. Yet despite these alarming trends, Cuba's agricultural sector hasn't completely collapsed. A significant part of that resilience can be traced to China's consistent, two-pronged approach, immediate relief combined with long-term capacity building. In April 2023, for example, China formally handed over a comprehensive aid package designed to improve Cuba's drought response and wastewater management infrastructure. The shipment included water tank trucks, sludge suction vehicles, high-pressure cleaning equipment, dump trucks, and pipe fusion machines, 449 pieces of equipment across 33 categories. These weren't symbolic gifts. They were functional tools aimed at strengthening water supply systems and reducing public health risks. Chinese technical teams followed up with on-site training to ensure the equipment could be effectively deployed. Beyond infrastructure, China also provided direct food aid. In 2024, Beijing sent 20,000 tons of emergency rice to Cuba, helping to stabilize food supplies during a particularly difficult period. The current shipment of 30,000 tons represents a continuation and an escalation of that commitment. The logic of sanctions and the limits of isolation. From Washington's perspective, the goal of sanctions isn't necessarily to deliver a knockout blow. It's to apply sustained multidimensional pressure, economic, financial, logistical, that slowly drains a target nation's capacity to function. Sanctions are designed to cut off access to capital, scare away third-party partners, and push a country to the margins of the global system. Over time, the hope is that internal discontent will force political change. But sanctions only work if the isolation is complete, and that's where the strategy begins to fray. As long as countries like China, and at times Mexico or Russia, are willing to provide critical resources like food, fuel, or credit, the effectiveness of U.S. sanctions diminishes. They may still inflict pain, but they fail to achieve total containment. In Cuba's case, China's rice shipments don't just ease hunger, they puncture the narrative of inevitability that sanctions are meant to construct. What this means, and what comes next. China's decision to send 30,000 tons of rice to Cuba is more than an act of charity. It's a geopolitical statement. It signals that in an era of renewed great power competition, alliances are being redrawn not just through military pacts or trade agreements, but through quiet, consistent acts of solidarity. For Cuba, it's a reminder that despite decades of isolation, it still has friends. For the United States, it's a reminder that unilateral sanctions, no matter how comprehensive, can be circumvented when other powers choose to push back. And for the rest of the world, it's a case study in resilience. How a small nation, battered by economics and geography, continues to navigate survival in a system designed to crush it. The shipments of rice will keep coming in the months ahead. The power outages in Havana will likely continue. The sanctions will remain in place. But what has changed, perhaps, is the sense that Cuba is entirely alone. And in geopolitics, as in life, that perception can matter as much as the resources themselves. If you found this story compelling and want to stay informed on global events that shape our world, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We'll continue bringing you in-depth analysis and stories that go beyond the headlines.